really wonderful to see people gathered in James Chapel for what is really, apart from convocation and daily chapel, our first public event where we come together for conversation of the year. So it just great to see everyone. And hello to all of you who have signed on remotely. We're glad that you're with us in your living rooms or kitchens or wherever you're sitting to be a part of this conversation. I'm Serene Jones, and I'm the president here at Union. And I am pleased to be able to welcome you to the Episcopal Divinity School at Union's Fall Community Read with Dr. Khalil Muhammad, author, professor, brilliant presence in the world, amazing human being, cutting edge thinker, and contributor to the critically important 1619 project. But before we get to our speaker, I have the pleasure of introducing the Dean of EDS at Union, my colleague and friend, the very Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, who also at Union holds the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in theology. And many people in this room have had the chance to study with Dean Douglas. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and is theologian in residence at Trinity Wall Street Church in New York City. She is the author of Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, many other books and articles, and I'm so excited to say she is the author of a very soon forthcoming book entitled Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, a conversation-changing theological intervention. So, Dean Douglas, I, with great joy, turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Serene. And thank each of you for joining us, and those of you here, as well as those of you online. One of the hazards of wearing a mask with glasses is it keeps fogging up my glasses. So thank you for letting me take that off, at least for now. Each semester, we select a book read for the entire community to read, one that addresses a pressing social issue. This semester, for the first time, we did not select a book, if you will. Rather, we selected the 1619 Project, the ongoing project from the New York Times Magazine that aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Throughout this semester, we are examining the essays and key themes from the 1619 Project. We knew we wanted to host one of the essayists who contributed to the project. And I was especially excited when we learned that Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad was available to be with us. His scholarship has informed my own work in writing for a long time. And I have to recommend to each of you his groundbreaking book, first published in 2010, and because of its significance, has been reprinted and re-released in 2009, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is also an award-winning book, which outlines the parallels of policing in America's North and South, both regions hinged on the use of brutal force to control Black bodies. I am especially thrilled to have you here with us this evening, Dr. Muhammad. But I'm going to ask Serene to return and to help actually welcome him to the stage.
So we're trying to figure out the masks and the mic thing. So this is part of the moving around. So thank you, Kelly, for setting the stage and describing the book read and the incredible influence of our speaker this evening. Dr. Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and serves as the director of Harvard's Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. As Dean Douglas mentioned, he is author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, which won the John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. I'm sure you've seen him in such films as Slavery by Another Name on PBS, The Forgotten Four, The Integration of Pro Football, and Ava DuVernay's 13th, a documentary about how the 13th Amendment led to mass incarceration in the United States. Today, we're going to hear more about his 1619 Project essay on the barbaric history of sugar production in America. His essay clearly outlines how sugar, referred to as white gold, harvested by slaves, drove wealth and acted as the economic engine for the Americans and other European nations, and how the sugar trade still today is impacting the lives of Black Americans. There is so much more to say, which will be said as the evening talk and conversation continues, but we're just absolutely delighted and honored to have you with us for this. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, President Jones, for that warm introduction, and most especially to Dean Douglas, who's been an incredibly gracious host for the past couple of hours. Got a chance to get to know her better, and just inspired by the example she sets here at school, at EDS and at Union. I also want to thank the graduate students. I'm trying to settle myself. To thank the graduate students who I met with earlier, who took the time to share their own thoughts and reflections about how they're thinking about this work, these legacies, these reckonings, all of which, that's just in case power goes away, all of which I think are relevant to the moment that we share in our time on this earth. I think one of the key themes of both the 1619 Project as well as the work that we do here, a school of theology can't help but interrogate the past. And the call to the obligation and responsibility for facing the past fearlessly, I think is the challenge of this moment. It's not the first time we've been down this road, but let's make the path forward the first time that we've done the right thing. So I'm going to share significant portions of a revised version of the essay you all read. So hopefully that will spark your imagination and you'll be able to tell if you've read the original essay where there is newness. And I know that those here in the live audience are likely to have read the essay, but perhaps in the virtual audience, there are newcomers to this history. So I think we're going to try to balance some Q&A both in person and virtual. So I look forward to those responses. Today, Black men at Angola prison harvest sugarcane. Today. the largest maximum security prison by landmass, made up of 5 former plantations. And they don't just harvest sugarcane, they turn it into syrup. And that syrup is sold in the prison gift shop. Today, Domino Park in Brooklyn is a 5-acre site of gentrified leisure, a playground where white families, many new to the area, can be seen with their young children frolicking on the sugar cube slide and picnicking on the ground that once housed the largest sugar refineries in the nation and made its owners, the Habermeyer family, one of New York's wealthiest dynasties. The family name can be seen around the city on streets and at universities and as part of the Metropolitan Museum, as we talked about earlier, for having donated one of the largest collections in the museum's history. Most, if not all, that money traces its roots to sugar, the white gold of European conquest. Today's Domino Sugar Calumet refinery is now the largest refinery in the US in Arabi, Louisiana. Sits about 5 miles east by way of the River's Bend from the French Quarter, and less than a mile down from the 9th Ward, where Hurricane Katrina and the failed levees destroyed so many Black lives. Today, Black and brown men of indigenous ancestry continue to toil in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, India, many parts of the world, making sugar that satisfies the appetites of people all over the world. And even still today, on the banks of the Mississippi River, a few dozen miles west of New Orleans, rusted sugar mills dot the fertile landscape of southern Louisiana. Rising high above country roads bordered on 2 sides by dense foliage, the mill smokestacks stand like rounded obelisks, monuments to Queen Sugar's regal past. But the plantation houses and fields that once fed these mills are hidden, concealed down long driveways, behind thick underbrush, and trapped in a false memory of the past. The Whitney plantation is different. It sits on the northern edge of the St. John the Baptist Parish, once home to dozens of thriving sugar plantations. But unlike the others, it beckons to passersby. When you approach the place, at the edge of a gravelly entrance, a bright white sign with red lettering announces the story of slavery. Framed by lush trees in need of trimming, the Whitney plantation's main residence, where generations of enslavers once lived, is a French colonial structure built for the tropical climate. Its wide-hipped roof overhangs a 2-level wraparound porch that offers maximal shade. Louvered doors and window shutters abound, a means of managing the insufferable hot, sticky air. 9 columns stand squat across the front of the house, seeming to reach down into the soil like anchors to keep the Atlantic hurricanes from washing it into the waters from whence its enslaved workers originally came. The rear of the house opens to a green expanse where all is visible. The first structure you see is the main kitchen, a detached building 200 feet to the right of the house. Down a bit further is a mule barn, a blacksmith shop, the machinery of sugar making, and a half dozen slave quarters that resemble the dilapidated shotgun homes of New Orleans' lower 9th Ward, except without the paint. From the enslaver's bedroom windows, the Whitney's cane fields stretch out to the horizon. Before the Europeans arrived, all of the land was home to Tensa Indians. German farmers began arriving in 1719, displaced them, and after which the area was called the German Coast, because unlike most of the earliest colonial settlers to Louisiana, these particular newcomers were not French. The Whitney plantation was built in 1752, and from its rich soil, enslaved Africans, many of whom were from Senegambia, cultivated corn, indigo, rice, until sugar took over at the turn of the 19th century. The Whitney operated continuously until 1975, and today it is a museum. But unlike many plantation museums in the South, this one is designed not to glorify a past of putatively genteel masters and mistresses, to educate visitors about the backbreaking work of the enslaved. The Whitney offers visitors a chance to bear witness to the exploitation and extraction that are the foundation of the modern world. What little Americans are taught or think they know about the slavery-based economy, or a slavery-based economy, and it's largely a success story of how cotton became the nation's leading export in the 19th century. Some people might also think about tobacco as a cash crop worked by enslaved people in places like Virginia in earlier eras. But even though cotton and tobacco dominated the colonial American economy, it was sugar that anchored the economy of the larger Atlantic world. This from the 16th century onward. Sugar slavery, which was uniquely destructive and deadly, made Brazil the focal point in the triangular trade. In the century before, 20 to 30 Africans landed in Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. Indeed, something like 10 million arrived in South America and the Caribbean as compared to roughly 600,000 in North America. White gold, as sugar was called, drove trade in goods and people, fueled the wealth of European nations, and for the British in particular, shored up the financing of the North American colonies. Over the span of nearly 300 years, from the mid-16th century on, a succession of European nations, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, France, and Britain, plied an international slave trade with African elites and dealers on one side of the ocean, and an insatiable demand by white colonizers for enslaved labor on the other. It is not an overstatement to say that the crop they produced changed the world. Cane stalks still grow at the Whitney Plantation Museum, as they do on nearly every speck of fertile ground as far as the eye can see, a lush green testament to that continuing demand for the plant's sweet juice. The Whitney's tiny annual crop, which helps pay the museum's bills, is an infinitesimal portion of a domestic sugar production, which itself is but a portion of a global sugar industry that produces some 200 million tons per year. The world's leading producer is Brazil, which also began its industry with enslaved African labor. The United States is fifth in production and produces about 9 million tons annually. Domestically, the sugar produced from sugar cane and sugar beets remains one of the country's most important agricultural products. Louisiana's sugarcane industry is worth $3 billion alone, generating an estimated 16,400 jobs. As important as sugar has become to American agriculture, it has had an even bigger impact on the American diet, which contains as much as 72.7 pounds of sugar and related sweeteners, such as high fructose corn syrup, per person per year, according to the United States Department of Agriculture. That makes us the biggest per capita consumers of sugar in the world. Those 9 million tons we grow each year aren't even enough to meet our demand. We import an additional 3 million tons. And sugar is no average foodstuff. What was once a luxury to adorn the lavish banquets of elites has become a toxic foodstuff for the masses. America's high rate of sugar consumption is a major factor in poor nutritional health. The average American sugar consumption is nearly twice the limit the USDA recommends based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And sugar has been linked in the United States to diabetes, obesity, and cancer. Over the last 30 years, the group of Americans who are obese or overweight grew 30% among all adults to 73% from 56%, according to the Centers for Disease Control. During the same period, diabetes rates nearly tripled. But if sugar is killing all of us, it is killing Black people faster. In the food deserts of many red-lined Black communities where supermarkets are scarce, cheap, sugary, processed foods fill the shelves of convenience stores and the bellies of Black shoppers. African Americans are overrepresented in the national figures on obesity, diabetes rates among Black men and women are nearly 1.5 times those of white men and women. One of the great ironies of sugar's history in the United States is that the brutal work of the enslaved created an industry whose success in producing unhealthy food for mass consumption has taken its greatest toll on Black communities today. None of this was in any way foreordained or even predictable. For thousands of years, sugarcane was a heavy and unwieldy crop that had to be cut by hand and immediately ground to release the juice inside. Otherwise, it would spoil in a day or two. Even before harvest time, rows had to be dug, stalks planted, and plentiful wood chopped as fuel for boiling the liquid and reducing it to crystals and molasses. From the earliest traces of cane domestication on the Pacific island of New Guinea 10,000 years ago to its island hopping advance to ancient India in 350 BC, sugar was locally consumed and remained little more than an exotic spice, medicinal glaze, or sweetener for elite palates. This was in part because it was incredibly labor intensive to produce. To achieve scale for export and trade, cane required tremendous, coerced, and coordinated human labor in warm climates and fertile land. It was, after all, Christopher Columbus's second voyage across the Atlantic in 1943, bringing sugarcane stalks with him from the Spanish Canary Islands, that everything changed. By then, Spain and Portugal had already begun to put enslaved Africans to work growing sugarcane on the Atlantic islands off the coast of North Africa. And the potential for an industry based on forced labor, fertile land, and a dawning era of global trade had reached an inflection point that would bring us modern capitalism today. Over the next 2 centuries, on the sugar islands of the Greater Antilles, San Domingue, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, among others, in the mainlands of Mexico and Brazil, European powers destroyed countless indigenous lives as colonizers staked out vast agricultural operations on their land and enslaved millions of Africans to work the fields. By the mid-17th century, in this already established Atlantic world, the British would stake a claim to the sugar islands of Barbados and Jamaica, and the North American colonies too. Soon they came to dominate the international slave trade. Although England first established trading posts for acquiring gold and ivory along a span of 5,000 coastal miles from present-day Morocco to South Africa, by 1672, King Charles II had conferred a monopoly on the Royal African Company, specifically for the slave trade. The company used military personnel, government agents, and private investment capital. We kind of know what that looks like these days, garnered by selling stock to merchants to build the single most successful transatlantic slave trading institution in history. Ships traveled a sea route that in the simplest form resembled an isosceles triangle. The voyage typically started with Royal African ships departing from Bristol, Liverpool, or London, heading to Africa carrying rum, guns, iron bars, fetters, glass beads, clothes, and copper pots to trade for people. Those ships would arrive, for example, in Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana, Britain's West African slaving capital, where they would load African captives. With their human cargo in tow, they would sail across the Atlantic. This became known as the Middle Passage, since it was the middle leg of the triangular route. Arriving in Barbados or Jamaica, the ships would exchange people for sugar, molasses, and lumber. From there, they would return home to England, completing the last part of the triangle. Other forms of this triangular route existed, with stops in North American colonies to load rice, tobacco, flour, and rum. But the crucial leg of the journey was the Middle Passage. Without African lives as the human raw materials in the making of sugar, along with other wealth-producing plantation commodities, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton, the distribution of Atlantic peoples and the wealth of the world we know today would likely be very different. From finance to finished goods, the transatlantic trade spawned a dizzying array of British businesses, manufacturing ships and armaments, glass and iron works, linen and pottery, and distilling rum and beer, all of which would be sold in Africa, the West Indies, and North America, as well as its home in the British Isles. Are we not indebted to that valuable people, the Africans, for our sugars, tobaccos, rice, rum, and all other plantation produce? Asked Malachi Postlethwaite, a London merchant and member of the Royal African Company. The more Negroes imported, he wrote, the more British goods were made and exported for trade. The Negro trade, he emphasized, was the foundation of an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power to this nation. Postlethwaite's bullish report was backed by solid evidence. In its first decade, the Royal African Company of England rapidly increased its share of the trade from 1/3 to 3/4 of the market. In Bristol, England, a local analyst writing about the 18th century noted there is not a brick in the city but what is cemented by the blood of a slave. The voracious appetite for wealth creation and the unquenchable taste for sugar combined to create the foundation of this modern world. From the time the Royal African Company enslavers set sail for North America through the years of the American Revolution and until the abolition of the international slave trade in 1807, Britain was responsible alone for roughly 3 million souls, many of them forever branded with the company's initials, RAC, on their skin, and would be forcibly removed from their homes, their kin, and their way of life. The majority of them to feed the demand for a sweetener. Countless fortunes were made. In Liverpool, the Martins Bank building opened in 1932, and the former home of Barclays memorialized the role of banks in financing the trade with a relief sculpture of 2 African boys fettered about the neck and ankles and holding bags of money. The slave trade was complex and evolved out of existing networks of exchange indigenous to Africa. Before European slavers arrived, African chiefs and merchants were already trading among themselves along well-established routes from west to east, from the Saharan north to the sub-Saharan south, and all points in between. In addition to trading palm cloth, copper jewelry, ivory, ornaments, cutlery, wood, and musical instruments, merchants would exchange enslaved people captured in wars or village raids. Like elsewhere in the world, a ready system of servitude already existed, writes historian Shawande Mustakim. European traders came as business partners in what she calls the human manufacturing process, which consisted of 3 violent stages: capture, transport, and delivery, for the brutalities of work awaiting those on faraway sugar plantations. African elites did not typically sell their own kin. Captives tended to be culturally and ethnically alien to those who enslaved them. Many captives were prisoners of war, others people labeled as criminals, undesirables, or outcasts and treated with disdain. Mustakim cites 70% for the proportion of, quote, purchased slaves, who by the 18th century had been snatched from their homes and communities before being removed by sea. Few non-elites were spared. One example recorded in the testimony given to the British Parliament's House of Commons in the late 1700s gives a sense of the violence of the enterprise. Off the coast of Bonny Point in present-day Nigeria, a young woman was grabbed by 2 men who, quote, secured her hands behind her back, beat her, and ill-used her on account of the resistance she made, according to testimony given by John Douglas, a slave trader. Traders routinely tore families asunder as they captured and stole people away from mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. Strong, healthy African men in their prime, between 15 and 25 years old, made up the bulk of the enslaved at sea. Ship captains aimed for a 2-to-1 ratio of men to women, with a small percentage of boys and girls. Traders judged women's fitness by their reproductive potential, just as horse breeders might judge the qualities of a broodmare. In the House of Lords records of certificate of slaves taken on board ships, one merchant recorded, quote, the women in general having good breasts were strong and well. Slavery at sea, as historians have long written, brought terrors to the captives beyond our worst nightmares. The extreme challenges of food preservation and water rationing made the transoceanic journey itself treacherous. the economics of the trade and financial incentives for captains and ship surgeons conspired to keep alive as many captives as possible. But there were limits, starting with space. The surgeon Alexander Falconbridge described conditions aboard his ship where captives had not so much room, he wrote, as a man in his coffin, neither in length or breadth, and it was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. Captain John Ashley testified before the members of the House of Commons that he, quote, frequently heard them crying out when below for the want of air. Suffocating as if buried alive, with human waste uncontainable, men were shackled side by side as metal and iron tore into flesh with every jolt of the ocean. Mustaqim found a report in the archives of several men on the slaver, the Venus, who died from part of the scrotum torn off with their irons. Slave crews typically separated men from women, leaving women in their own quarters, unchained and unprotected, all the easier for sailors to rape them. John Newton, a slave trader turned abolitionist who wrote the hymn, Amazing Grace, if there was ever an audience to know, described this in his memoir. They are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. Another ship's crew referred to the area where women were held as the, quote, whore hole. Instances of sexual violation on these voyages are impossible to count definitively, but from ship logs, journals, and testimonies, it is evident that they were numerous. On the British vessel African in 1753, a man named William Cooney raped a pregnant woman. She was listed in the log as number 83, following a common practice of a kind of dead naming of captives. He took her into the room and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarterdeck. In these moments, slave traders were conditioning Africans for plantation slavery. But the captives were also forming a new identity, a diasporic Blackness forged out of their collective fate as they found strength in each other with every miserable day that passed. Uprisings of captives at sea were rare, but were the most spectacular instances of collective resistance. A 1731 insurrection involved 140 Africans. They killed most of the crew and escaped with the ship. When I read this passage to my daughter, she cheered. Much more frequent acts of resistance took the form of recalcitrance, a refusal by captives to eat or to exercise. They plotted conspiracies to poison the crew's food and beverage, and they also took complete control of their individual bodies and minds. And they also took complete control of their individual bodies and minds when they sought freedom in another realm. The surgeon, Isaac Wilson, recalled a man who threw himself into the sea and seemed to relish his own drowning. He, quote, went down as if exulting that he got away, the physician remembered. On the Middle Passage, mortality rates ranged from 5 to 20%, lowering as the centuries passed. Africans died most often from diseases such as scurvy and acute vitamin C deficiency, smallpox, pneumonia, and tapeworms. The flux or dysentery, the most common cause of death, produced its own slow torture of blood-soaked diarrhea and incessant vomiting triggered by a bacterial infection from contaminated food or water. Americans today tend not to think of sugar as the cause of all this destruction, or even as the primary crop of slavery, in part because production was mostly limited to the West Indies, colonies held by Spain, Britain, and France that did not ultimately become part of the United States. But the one exception for this time period is Louisiana, which was occupied by the French until 1803. In New Orleans in 1751, French Jesuit priests planted the first cane stalks in the area near Baronne Street. In the Gulf region of southern Louisiana, weather conditions were more like those in the Caribbean, a geographic space the historian Matthew Couture dubbed the American Mediterranean. Given the city's tropical climate, the plant thrived, whereas it had failed to do so in the British colonies of Georgia and South Carolina before the United States was founded. Within a few decades, sugarcane production in Louisiana took root. In 1795, Etienne de Boer, a New Orleans sugar planter, granulated the first sugar crystals in the Louisiana territory. With the advent of local sugar processing, plantations exploded up and down both banks of the Mississippi River. One of the major contributors to the booming Louisiana sugar industry was the outcome of the Haitian Revolution. More French planters and their enslaved export sugar workers poured into Louisiana as Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines led a successful revolt in Saint-Domingue, later known as Haiti, to secure independence from France in 1804. For decades, Saint-Domingue had been a top producer in sugar, and an especially brutal one. So perhaps it is no surprise that the African-descended inhabitants of that colony became the first enslaved sugar workers to rebel and win. It was just 1 year before, in 1803, that the Whitney plantation had become a prosperous sugar operation under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Haydel Sr., who had inherited the property from his father, Ambrose Haydel. In 1820, Haydel Sr. passed on the plantation to his two sons and eventually to a widowed daughter-in-law, Marie Azalée Haydel, in 1840. Marie Haydel, in turn, became one of Louisiana's most successful planters. In the 1840s and 50s, the plantation produced hundreds of thousands of pounds of sugar, peaking in 1854-1855 season with 407,000 pounds. According to the Whitney Museum's Director of Research, this made that plantation one of the most important in the state. The Whitney's economic success contributed to Louisiana's rapid growth in the global sugar trade. By the 1850s, Louisiana planters were producing a quarter of the world's cane sugar supply. During her antebellum reign, Queen Sugar bested King Cotton locally, making Louisiana the second richest state in per capita wealth. And according to the historian Richard Follett, in 1840, the state ranked third in banking capital behind New York and Massachusetts. The value of enslaved people alone represented tens of millions of dollars in capital that financed investments, loans, and businesses. Much of that investment funneled back into the sugar mills, the most industrialized sector of Southern agriculture. No other agricultural region came close to the amount of capital investment in farming by the eve of the Civil War, shattering our ongoing myths about the South as a place of the past, rather than as a place helping to usher in the future. In 1853, Representative Miles Taylor of Louisiana bragged that his state's success was without parallel in the United States, or indeed in the world, in any branch of industry. None of this growth was possible without trafficking in human lives. As a result, Louisiana's enslaved population soared, quadrupling over a 20-year period to 125,000 souls in the mid-19th century. New Orleans became the Walmart of people selling. The number of enslaved labor crews on its sugar plantations doubled, and in every sugar parish, Black people outnumbered whites. These were some of the most skilled workers doing some of the most dangerous agricultural and industrial work in the United States. Some enslaved workers mastered the technical skills of distillation, turning cane juice into raw sugar and molasses under intense time pressure to ensure no spoilage and maximum yields. In the mills, alongside adults, children toiled like factory workers with assembly-like precision and discipline, like under the constant threat of boiling hot kettles, open furnaces, and grinding rollers. All along the endless carrier are ranged slave children whose business it is to place cane upon it when it is conveyed through the shed into the main building, wrote the freeborn upstate New Yorker Solomon Northup in his slave narrative, 12 Years a Slave, of being kidnapped in 1853 while visiting Washington, D.C. To achieve the highest efficiency, sugar houses operated night and day. On cane plantations and sugar time, there is no distinction as to the days of the week, Northup wrote. Fatigue might mean losing an arm to the grinding rollers or being flayed for failing to keep up. Enslavers often met resistance with sadistic cruelty. A formerly enslaved Black woman named Mrs. Webb described a torture chamber used by her enslaver, Balsan Marsmillian. One of his cruelties was to place a disobedient slave standing in a box in which there were nails placed in such a manner that the poor creature was unable to move, she told a WPA interviewer in 1940. He was powerless even to chase the flies, or sometimes ants crawling on some parts of his body. Louisiana led the nation in destroying the lives of Black people in the name of economic efficiency, a story all too familiar in these difficult times. Life expectancy was lower than on a cotton plantation and closer to that of a Jamaican cane field, where the most overworked and abused could drop dead after 7 years of labor. Nevertheless, some enslaved sugar workers managed to fight back. In 1811, on the German coast, near the Whitney plantation, as many as 500 sugar rebels joined a liberation army heading to New Orleans, one of the largest revolts of enslaved people in United States history, and perhaps one of the largest stories of Black resistance you've never heard about. They were soon cut down by federal troops and local militia. No record of their actual plans survived. About 100 were killed in battle or executed later. Many of their heads were severed and placed on pikes throughout the region, kind of a scene like Game of Thrones. There were nearly twice as many executions as there were during Nat Turner's more well-known 1831 rebellion, according to historians' estimates. There are no oral histories from the Whitney plantation to preserve the firsthand testimonies of those who experienced the harsh brutalities of life there. The museum's archived inventory of records of enslaved people at the time of Marie Haydell's passing in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War suggests that the enslavers systematically sold children for profit, severing offspring from parents. According to Ashley Rogers, the Whitney's executive director, of the 101 people counted at the time of Haydell's passing, most were adult men, several were Creole-identified women, and 32 were young children. Those young children could not be sold under Louisiana law unless accompanied by their mothers, except there were no children older than 10 years, she told me. None. America's sugar slavery ended in 1865, but by that point, sugar was a staple product everywhere in the world. After the Civil War, Black people sought to build lives on their own terms, and in the decades that followed, US sugar plantations reorganized themselves around the labor of free Black workers. Though many Black Louisianans found the crushing work with sugarcane remained mostly the same, during the early days of Reconstruction, Black political organizing in the form of union leagues swept the sugar region along with the rest of the South. Given the large Black populations in these areas, freedmen made significant gains overnight, electing Black state officials and inspiring economic changes and labor organizing on sugar plantations. Freedmen's Bureau agents often noted in their reports that planters frequently complained that when they dismissed one worker, the others would, quote, immediately quit work and threaten to leave the place. As new wage earners, Black sugar workers negotiated the best terms they could, signed labor contracts for up to a year, and moved from one plantation to another in search of a life whose daily rhythms beat differently than before. But the gains of Reconstruction were short-lived. As W.E.B. Du Bois so eloquently wrote in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, quote, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. The domestic terrorism that ended Reconstruction and destroyed so many Black lives was particularly vicious in the sugar region. Striking sugar workers were often met with swift and violent reprisals. In November 1887, a decade after former Confederates had regained political control of the South and had terrorized and purged much of Louisiana's Black political leadership from office, a national union attempted to organize sugar workers. In 3 parishes during harvest season, workers had downed their tools and walked off the job and insisted on higher wages paid in cash rather than plantation credit. Strike breakers and state militia responded with a show of force. Shots rang out, and at least 30 Black people, some sources estimated hundreds, were killed in their homes and on the streets of Thibodaux, Louisiana. We might think here of a prelude to Tulsa. I think this will settle the question of who is to rule, the nigger or the white man, for the next 50 years, a local white planter's widow, Mary Pugh, wrote, rejoicing to her son. White power never lost its grip on the land. Compared with Black sharecropping on cotton plantations, where African Americans gained a tiny measure of physical independence as individual family units living and working on white-owned land, Black cane workers had little choice often but to live in somebody's old slave quarters, hearkening back to the lower Ninth Ward of Louisiana, of New Orleans. As had been the case for centuries, making cane into sugar required access to huge swaths of land, large amounts of capital, and gang labor to plant, harvest, and mill the crop. In spite of the substantial barriers of capital and racism, African Americans nevertheless aspired to own sugarcane farms or rent them from white owners. And a small number of Black sugarcane farmers inherited land from their antebellum free Black ancestors or accumulated property in spite of it all on their own. But they faced discrimination at every turn, and the threat of violence if their success challenged the Jim Crow racial order. The historian Rebecca Scott found that although Black farmers were occasionally able to buy plots of cane land from bankrupt estates or otherwise establish themselves as suppliers, the trend was for planters to seek to establish relations with white tenants or white sharecroppers who could provide cane for the mill. Racist actions by government agencies, banks, and real estate developers conspired to take Black farmers' land after they had succeeded against the odds. Here enters the story of June and Angie Provost, of which you read in the original essay. By World War II, many Black people began to move from a cane field to a car factory in the North. Between 1947 and 1963, Whitney's payroll records show a significant reduction in the workforce. Mechanization continued to shrink the number of jobs, leaving only poorly paid seasonal work for even less pay. With fewer and fewer Black workers in the industry, labor recruiters in Louisiana and Florida sought workers in other states. In 1942, the Department of Justice began a major investigation into the recruiting practices of one of the largest sugar producers in the nation, the United States Sugar Corporation, South Florida Company. Black men unfamiliar with the brutal nature of the work were promised seasonal sugar jobs at high wages only to be forced into debt peonage, immediately accruing the cost of their own transportation to Florida, the lodging and the equipment they used, all for $1.80 in compensation a day. One man testified that the conditions were so bad, he said it wasn't no freedom, it was worse than the pen. Federal investigators agreed. When workers tried to escape, the FBI found they were captured on the highway or shot at while trying to hitch rides on sugar trains. The company was indicted by a federal grand jury in Tampa for carrying out a conspiracy to commit slavery. Ultimately, the indictment was quashed on a procedural matter. A congressional investigation some decades later in the 1980s found much of the same. The sugar companies had systematically tried to exploit seasonal West Indian workers to maintain absolute control over them, and which is true in lawsuits filed at this very moment today, with the constant threat of immediately sending them back to where they came from. No one is cutting cane today unless they have no power in society, Ashley Rogers said. Since sugarcane came to these shores, there hasn't been a time when Black people weren't getting the short end of a cane stalk. From plantation to farm to table, African Americans have always paid the highest cost for sugar cultivation. Though Black labor no longer plays a big role in producing sugar here in the United States, sugar still plays a big role in the lives of Black people. Among all Americans, added dietary sugar has been linked to growing rates of chronic illnesses, of which Black people suffer the most. African Americans are more likely to eat poorer quality processed foods with high amounts of added sugars. In 2013, public health researchers at Johns Hopkins University used the US Census and a food store data survey to analyze supermarket availability by census tract. As poverty increased, the number of supermarkets decreased, but the prevalence of junk food stock convenience stores increased. And when poverty was held constant, the researchers found that Black communities still had the fewest supermarkets. In a 2015 study of healthful food availability in Topeka, Kansas, researchers at Kansas State University found that even low-income white neighborhoods were twice as likely to have a food store as Black ones. Food deserts and food insecurity, they wrote, are perhaps the most important deleterious consequences of residential segregation in the United States. The scarcity of healthful, affordable food options in Black neighborhoods is offset by the abundance of bad ones. Recent nutritional surveys by the National Center for Health Statistics found that among children, adolescents, and adults, Black people consume a higher percentage of their daily calories from fast food than do Hispanics and whites. In addition, certain food companies have targeted Black youths with advertising. A marketing analysis of television advertising dollars found a 50% increase between 2013 and 2017 in food ads for fast foods, candy, sugary drinks, and snacks aimed at Black households. Kumanyika, a co-author of the study and the chair of Drexel University's Council on Black Health, said of the findings, and I quote, "At best, these advertising patterns imply that food companies view Black consumers as interested in candy, sugary drinks, fast food, and snacks with a lot of salt, fat, or sugar, but not in healthier foods." Leaving the Whitney plantation, I travel along River Road, heading south towards New Orleans. The Mississippi River snakes along the road just beyond view of the grass-covered levees. All is quiet and sun-drenched. Round hay bales lie like small animals resting peacefully atop the grass. There's something idyllic and innocent about the landscape. And yet, nothing is innocent about the place. Nature has conspired with human beings to do a great harm. This mighty river is and always has been the lifeblood of the region, nurturing the southern Louisiana soil and linking this place to a many centuries old Atlantic market in sugar and slaves. It bears witness to all that has happened here, the lives stolen, shipped, and sold on plantations, the hopes and dreams of new possibilities at the first sounds of civil war, and the harsh realities of lives cut short by the weight of all this history. What the levees try to conceal, the tombs don't. On the opposite side of the road, out the passenger's window, roadside graveyards appear every few miles. I stop at one to get a closer look and pay respect to the dead. I close my eyes and imagine these concrete, above-ground coffins floating up the Mississippi River all the way from somewhere along the route of the Middle Passage and landing at this final resting place. This hallowed ground sits at the end of a gravel road that once led to the plantation house and the sugar mills. Cane stalks are all around, and were it not for a touch of landscaping, the cane might swallow the graveyard altogether. Some of the tombs stand out because of large engravings of a cross, because they are adorned with weather-beaten plastic flowers. But all of them bear the names of precious lives interred here. I can't help but think that generations of these people, my people, never left the cane fields at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your essay and for that insightful, profound, and should I say illuminating talk and lecture. I want to pick up a little bit from where you left off in that regard, or build upon what you said. Sugar slavery. And you're right. It's something that we don't read about and that we don't talk about. And many Americans don't know about, including myself before reading your essay in the 1619 Project. Sugar slavery, while we talk about it in relationship even to the South, as you did, its legacy continued from the plantations into the North. And as you've spoken in another instance, you talk about the way in which it defies notions of the moral North.
The moral North, yeah.
The moral North.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a couple of things. First, how and why has this story of sugar slavery gotten lost or been lost to our history?
Yeah, it's gotten lost because we are not supposed to see the fullness of the foundations of why white and Black people are here in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And by here, I mean on this side of the Atlantic. And given that we are all subject to the miseducation of, for those of us who were born and educated in the United States, we do a terrible job of teaching histories that reflect the actual world that evolved over the past 500 years. And while the story of cotton is a story that's inescapable, in part, not just because there was a civil war, but because cotton is so bound up in the actual whitewashing of that history as a kind of nostalgic reflection of a time when the South was a place of gentility and wealth and power and influence. In other words, the old South narrative of a glorified past. And so in that way, cotton gained ascendancy in this retelling, in this myth making. And there was no need to mention sugar. No good could come from it. because if you pierce the veil of sugar, then you ended up in this bigger black, I guess the word I want to think of is an abyss of accountability is how we might think about it. And I think that's why this particular history is more like history rather than a story. Credit to the New York Times for wanting it, and secondarily, a credit to all the people who have done the labor in the archives to bring this information to us. I just happen to benefit from it and be able to write about it.
So let's continue sort of the digging down into that story. And as you have said, it defies the myth of the moral North. Right. And so what
you said that, but I like it.
Well, okay. I see. I thought I got it from you.
You're crediting it to me, but I'll give it back to you.
So you could have taken that credit, but it does, yeah. And it complicates, first of all, on many levels, the story of the North's involvement in slavery, but certainly from the sugar plantations, if you will, of the South, we have the sugar refineries of the North, and much of the money that the wealth of the North, particularly in New York City, is built upon sugar slavery. And of course, you spoke to the Havemeyers and the museum in Brooklyn that was a large sugar.
Well,
refinery.
The Metropolitan, but the once refinery in Brooklyn.
The refinery in
East
Brooklyn.
River, yeah.
So a couple of questions in that regard. First, what does it tell us? We know what slavery tells us about the South, but what does sugar slavery tell us about the nation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not even just the nation. It is the global economic system we have today. I mean, I know we were talking about my essay, but Matt Desmond's brilliant essay on low road capitalism, is very much in conversation with the history that I tell in this essay. And just to acknowledge, there is an ongoing, probably century-old debate between economists and historians about how to account for the transition from mercantilism, which is the economic term for nations controlling markets, to capitalism, where it's a free market of exchange, complicated, of course, by tariffs and this sort of thing. But and just to complicate this a bit further, so I teach a class on plutocracy, philanthropy, and the public good. And it's a great class because you realize that so much of what explains philanthropy as a way of using wealth as a form of political power runs through the history of slavery. The tax code for 501c3s today starts with a post-civil rights law that essentially said this money for educating the freedmen had to be only for educational purposes. And so all of these foundations and art museums, even like one that I'm on the board of, has at its heart education as its mission, because that links back to educating the freedmen as the basis for tax write-offs. Why I mention this story is that one of the readings we have is by an economist writing about philanthropy, and he tells a story of slavery where he says, in New England, where gradual abolition occurred at the founding of the nation, and where factories became the form of freedom for people to exchange their labor in exchange for a wage, represents the beginning of capitalism. And that what happened in Virginia and South Carolina was not only pre-capitalism, but was a backwards, undiversified economy that ultimately cost the South the ability to evolve. And so and this is a book published in 2013, he's an economist. And so we look at it for just this reason. And I show them that if you go to, this is one of my favorite stories. I know it's a longer answer, but I wanted to tell it as a story. If you go to New England today, and in particular to Rhode Island, where there were more slavers, which are the ships that were built to bring people here as enslaved people, more slave voyages left Rhode Island than any other colony, and more slavers left Rhode Island once it was the United States of America, not the colonial period. And in that same place, you will find the home of the whaling industry, site, say in New Bedford, Rhode Island, of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So here's the thing that's so fascinating. If you go to New Bedford today, you can visit the Whaling Museum, which says nothing about the slavers, even though it's not a slave vessel, but if you were to set the context for the place, you might acknowledge it. No mention. Secondarily, while it tells the story of whaling, it's its primary purpose. On the second floor of the museum is an entire exhibition dedicated to the industry that emerged after whaling, which was textile manufacturing. And in this room is a gigantic bale of cotton, as if that cotton was picked by itself and magically shipped to the area. And so it's in New Bedford that some of the most significant textile manufacturing occurs, including, I teach my students, this Wamsutta Mills, which some of you might even have Wamsutta sheets on your beds, which is sold at Bed Bath & Beyond and other stores to this day. And so even if we were honest about cotton in a different way, unlike this museum in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which also happens to be where Frederick Douglass first landed after he escaped from Baltimore, then we would probably have a different understanding of the North as a place that cannot be separated from the South. From finance to capital, from raw materials and processed goods, and the exchange of a Southern economy that depended on the North for things it did not make on its own, it wouldn't make any sense, right? But it's precisely the fact that we don't teach these histories honestly that we can end up with these constructs, these false narratives.
So, yes. and so many institutions in the North, all over, but let's focus on the North because I'm getting ready to focus on New York.
Got it.
Many institutions, even those that are seen as progressive and social justice seeking institutions, have built their wealth on enslaved labor. In terms of New York City, those institutions stem from the Long Island Railroad that was built on sugar slavery with the Havemeyers, to significant churches, Episcopal churches in this city, as well as to institutions. Union didn't build its wealth on the Havemeyers, but has a connection to the Havemeyers. What then ought to be the recompense or the reparations in terms of institutions that have indeed built their wealth or have connections to, even if they're progressive institutions and doing the work of social justice, but have connections to things like sugar slavery, particularly when you look around New York, it's almost impossible to talk about institutions that don't have a connection to this slavery.
Yeah, it's remarkable to recognize the scale of denial. I mean, part of the story of settler colonialism, which is a more encompassing way of naming what we're talking about here, is denial and disavowal. It's not only denial and disavowal, it's also the ascription of inferiority to people who, by dint of structures of extraction, cannot exist in the world in the way that is supposed to be universal and normal and human, even as defined by settler colonists and their descendants. And so I think the first step is honesty. I mean, literally, is honesty, is naming the relationship to these pasts. Just lift up a couple examples. The obvious example is Georgetown in this moment, has done a lot of work, a lot of this recovering of its own history and its own accounting for the relationship of that history to its ability to be the wealthy university it is. This kind of thing has been going on for a while, and I'd be remiss if I didn't name Ruth Simmons, President Simmons, formerly at Brown University, who did this work at that institution. And to model her legacy and example, not only did she commission the work that would lead to the truth-telling of that Rhode Island institution's wealth, which is legendary, she also endowed, through fundraising, permanent study of slavery for both that institution, the nation, and all who would take interest in that work, which you would think for higher education would be the easy way to align mission with the responsibility of reckoning with this past. Another manifestation of her leadership, which I think is another model for this kind of work, is I took my now sophomore in college at Northwestern child, Jordan, to visit Brown. And on the tour of the campus, the tour guides, our tour guide happened to be a young white woman, acknowledged both the indigenous land and the buildings around the campus that they know were built by enslaved people, which might seem like light work in the post-George Floyd moment, but I don't think it is, because The opposite happened when my son and I went to University of Maryland, and we came upon the Frederick Douglass Monument there. And the young white male tour guide said nothing about it. It was as if just being in the space was good enough, let's move on. So I think that institutions have a responsibility today to do their own homework about their own histories, about the way that money passed on generationally, so much of it tied to the colonial and antebellum period, and even the period after, which generated tremendous profits by virtue of the state of the Jim Crow period, which I increasingly refer to as American fascism. Might seem controversial, but in a time when we are closer to that reality than at any point in our history, we might learn a lot about what things look like for Black people living in a South where you could not vote, and the threat of state violence was at every turn. The last thing I'll say is that on the matter of recompense, again, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that universities still struggle with. Many of the faculty, if there was ever a moment to say, how do we need to invest in solving for legacies of racism and contemporary realities of racism that cut across various populations in our society as a way to maybe reconsider how stable our society is in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Really, right? Like if the
No,
pandemic doesn't expose our interdependence, and the fragility of the ongoing challenge of racial scapegoating, whether it's at the border or in our cities, doesn't suggest the imminent threat to democracy in general. And yet universities still can't see fit to ask their wealthy donors, some of whose money ties back to slavery, to invest in those areas of scholarship. It's just an absurdity beyond explanation to me. And I'll just name my own institution. Harvard is very complicit in this problem, including so much as supporting the education of incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people for credit, which has been an effort by some of my colleagues at Harvard has roundly repudiated, in a way in which, one last note on this, because I think this is just a way to show rather than tell. So the current president, in the midst of a lot of protests around prison divestment, who just recently agreed to fossil fuel divestment, was repeatedly pressured to divest of prisons, which is small in the endowment, but nevertheless a meaningful act for a $40 billion institutional investor like Harvard. We don't do politics with our money, was the response. But
with your already
absurd,
dirty, but
which
right.
is absurd, right? But anyway, and as a little bit of bait and switch, commissioned yet another study of slavery history at Harvard. And so notice the way that I'm calling for accountability, but accountability doesn't just end with a report. It also recognizes that these legacies are entwined with the present. And so we have a long way to go to continue to make these arguments and to be clear about what it is that needs to happen.
And what you're talking about here is not simply, once you tell the truth, that accountability, or as you're talking about, and they're going to do a study on slavery, then you have to do something with that truth that has been told. And this theological institution, we call that real repentance, that you turn around and do something different. You repent and turn around and do something differently. I'm going to ask one more question, and I think then we'll turn to questions from online and in the audience. What you're also speaking of when you're talking about institutions of higher education and other institutions, funding, for instance, scholarship that will indeed begin to bring a different gaze and change the narrative of the way in which we understand our history, and to begin to engage our history from a different point of view, a different angle of vision, as the 1619 Project does. And of course, doing that is currently under attack. You spoke, and I think this is from you, as you talked about in your book, A Condemnation of Blackness, as you were talking about a way to sort of break certain cycles. You said, we can choose, as some have done in the past, we can choose sympathy and faith and humanity over scorn and contempt. And in many respects, you were talking again about changing our vantage point, changing our gaze, changing our narratives. What's the role of faith and religious communities and even seminaries in changing that narrative, particularly if we're talking about sympathy and faith over condemnation and scorn?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I mean, I suppose one way to look at this, if we lived in a society where people generally did secularism as the basis for our politics and the way that we decide on collective, or we make collective decisions, then, you might say that these are generally individual acts tied to one's own moral compass. But we actually don't live in that society, right? So, because religious beliefs, and more particularly Christianity, forms the moral basis of what we owe each other, the basis of our freedom, so to speak, we have to demand honesty and truth from people who claim to represent the church and its many manifestations. I mean, I don't know how to solve. I mean, you're asking me a question that has an obvious answer, right? But in the sense that you would think, which has never been true, that people who are closest to the teachings of the Christian faith would walk closest to the truth of justice. But that hasn't been the history.
Right, and lead the way.
And lead the way.
And lead the
Correct.
way in terms of, in the public arena and public discourse and public spaces, to hold the nation accountable.
Right.
To walking closer to
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah. So we're
And
talking
justice.
really about majorities versus minorities, because we'd have another conversation, right? If Brother West was here, he would
Yes.
remind us of Reinhold Niebuhr, and who's the name of the chair he has? I don't know.
Bonhoeffer, Dietrich
Bonhoeffer,
Bonhoeffer.
right.
You can't come here.
I know.
Come on.
I only learned about Bonhoeffer.
Both of all of who walked
about-
these halls.
about
Yeah.
a few years ago, but I'm terrible with names.
I'm
So,
just teasing.
so I just want to acknowledge that this isn't all bad.
Yeah.
But my God, not to be put a pun on things. I mean, it's just remarkable. We seem to be moving backwards.
That's right.
And so I think the issue for me, as is true in this space, as it would be at my own university or in other parts of my own community, is if people remain silent about that challenge in places where they are proximate to the denial and disavowal, then shame on you.
Thank you. Do we have questions from online?
Sure. So we've had a robust conversation in the Zoom chat. So I'll share one comment.
I'm scared.
I'll share one comment and then a quick question that came up. One of the individuals who joined us tonight is one of the Black descendants of the Haydels. And just this past,
Haydels.
And just this past August, they referenced that there was a private tour of the Whitney plantation for the Black descendants to come together, and they shouted out the director of the Whitney Plantation Museum.
Yeah.
And that individual is also the chairperson for the state of California's first in the nation task force for the study of developing reparations proposals for African Americans. So that's somebody who's obviously directly impacted by this and doing the work today.
That's terrific.
Yeah. And then one of the questions that came up a couple times was if you just have a recommendation, people want to dive into this topic more deeply. Is there a book that was important for your research that you would recommend for folks?
So there's a young adult book that was actually helpful for me called Sugar Changed the World. It's referenced in the article. It's co-authored by Marina Budos, who's a terrific writer, Budhos, and Mark Aronson, Aronson. There's a book written by Elizabeth Abbott called Bittersweet, which is a kind of a global history of sugar. I use some more scholarly materials that are not like page turners, but I would say to people, go back to the original essay, and if they're curious, they can find the citations that are called out actually in the prose. This is a topic waiting for wonderful magisterial history. I mean, it really is global history, and anyway, that's what I can say for now.
We have a question from the audience.
One of my favorite authors used to say, her name's Arundhati Roy, and she would say, progress is a euphemism for violence. And I wanted to know if you agree with that. Will that always be true looking forward as we're looking back?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get the reference point because narratives of civilization were, in a very muscular way, defined explicitly a century ago as the need to take and to churn lives in the process. I mean, as a historian of the early 20th century, I mean, what's so compelling about that time period is that white men of science and white statesmen didn't mince their words about what was required in order for humanity to evolve. And the very notion that people in charge were in charge precisely because they knew how to use violence and were the victors of that tool. And I'm quoting people, here I'm drawing a little bit of my own research, but I'm quoting people who worked in the sociology. When during the primary, was it 20? I lost my elections. Yeah, it was Hillary running. Yeah, we just had 2020. It's Hillary running at that time. She kept saying, being progressive means progress. Like, do you remember this?
Right.
Like,
right.
like progressivism then became some notion of progress.
Right.
And it was insane, right? Because it was a rhetorical dodge against the actual progressive agenda situated in this vacuous idea that, I'm the candidate for progress. Anyway, yes, if people were more honest, they'd tell you that everyone's not meant to survive in the interest of the advancement of civilization. This may seem overly cynical, but if you can't be a little bit cynical in a school of theology, then where can you be? So, the space race between Richard Branson and Elon Musk, one can't help but think that this is another form of colonization, not because there's poor victims out there, although there might be, but because this is another way of escaping a burning planet that people who share their way of the world are responsible for killing. And so they're going to figure out how to lower the cost from $1 billion, a trip to, $100,000, and maybe some good folks from New York will be on some of these voyages soon. It's unbelievable.
I think we're at the end.
Is it gone already?
Yeah, it's gone already. 7:30, and so maybe if we'll take one more question. And while we're getting that question, it's not cynical. I mean, we look at what happened in COVID, and it reminds us that certain people aren't meant to survive. People are considered essential workers, but not essential human beings.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have to bring it back to this institution. Okay, yes. Oh, sorry. I have to bring it back to Union because across the hall on the administration hallway, there's a lovely portrait of Rosalind Habermeyer. And so we obviously are an institution in part that has benefited from, so as a school of theology, how do we discuss this? How do we make sure that we are accurately naming the history? Obviously, in her case, she married into this family. It had nothing, but we can't acknowledge her contribution to this institution without also acknowledging where all of that money came from.
Yeah. No, I think you've answered the question. It has to be acknowledged. It should be acknowledged. And I think it's a good modeling practice because, there are degrees of responsibility, shall we say. And so older institutions, just by dint of having been around long enough, will be part of these histories. And that's the easiest. The second would be individuals, whose relationships to these histories are demonstrable. We have an amazing ability to abstract responsibility when it's close to home and to be very clear about it when it's far away. Right? So we know exactly who the problem is in some other country. But here it's like, we don't. And it's not that it's not understandable, but it's not acceptable either.
Well, that's a good note to end on. What's not understandable is also not acceptable.
Right.
Thank you so much for your talk, your essay, your work, which moves us beyond even the sugar slavery and to the condemnation of Blackness. I recommend not only the essay and the 1619 Project and the 1619 Project in its totality, but I also highly commend to you Dr. Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the making of modern urban America. I highly commend that to all of your reading as well. And I thank you for this conversation, for your work, and for inspiring us all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.